In the vast universe of American music, Bob Dylan is a figure shrouded in mystery, brilliance, contradiction, and timeless influence. Born Robert Zimmerman in Duluth, Minnesota, in 1941, Dylan did not merely become a musician, he became a force of nature. He was the voice of a generation, the troubadour of rebellion, and a lyrical prophet. But with that towering legacy came tension, controversy, and bitter rivalries. Throughout his six-decade career, Dylan has had many artistic allies. However, there have also been significant clashes, moments of contempt, dismissal, or open rivalry with fellow musicians. Although Dylan rarely names names in a venomous fashion, there are a few artists with whom his criticisms or apparent disdain have become part of music history. This video dives deep into the four most notable figures who fell on the wrong side of Dylan's sharp tongue, penetrating sarcasm, or cryptic lyrical jabs. Whether driven by musical disagreements, personal betrayal, or generational ideology, Dylan's cold shoulder often said more than his public statements. But before delving into these individual stories, we must understand Bob Dylan's perspective on music itself. Dylan's early interviews were filled with hostility toward reporters. He dodged questions, spoke in riddles, and mocked the idea of being a spokesman for youth. He saw music not as a product to please the masses but as a deeply personal expression of truth, his truth. In the 1960s, while others were protesting in the streets, Dylan was withdrawing inward, writing songs like It's Alright Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, and Ballad of a Thin Man. He wasn't interested in fame or causes, he was interested in authenticity, in staying ahead of his imitators, and in constantly evolving. And herein lies the core of Dylan's judgment. He despised imitation, trend-chasing, and false prophets. Those who copied him, misunderstood him, or commercialized the folk spirit became targets. Not always with loud anger, but with Dylan's weapon of choice: distance, sarcasm, and lyrical fire. Bob Dylan doesn't hate the way most people do. He doesn't explode in public rants or record diss tracks. Instead, he shrinks away. He mocks with lines buried in verses. He gives cryptic interviews with phrases like, "That cat's always been a joke." For Dylan, hatred might not mean open war, but the severing of respect. And once respect is lost, a man is no longer a peer, he becomes a pretender. So, who were the biggest pretenders in Dylan's mind? Let's begin with one of the most famous. 1. Donovan. In the early 1960s, as Bob Dylan took the Greenwich Village folk scene by storm, a young British singer-songwriter named Donovan Leitch was rising across the Atlantic. With a gentle voice, harmonica in hand, and acoustic guitar, Donovan became a UK sensation. By 1965, the British press had already dubbed him the British Bob Dylan. The comparisons were inevitable. Donovan wore similar clothes, sang protest songs, and spoke of peace and youth. But Dylan was not amused. Bob Dylan first heard about Donovan during his 1965 UK tour. Journalists bombarded him with questions. What do you think of Donovan? They were baiting Dylan, hoping for a feud. In D.A. Pennebaker's documentary Don't Look Back, Dylan's reaction is recorded on film. Sitting in his hotel room with friends, Dylan scoffs at Donovan's name. "He's just a copy," Dylan says, laughing. "He's no threat." That phrase, "no threat," cut deep. It wasn't just dismissal, it was surgical erasure. Dylan didn't need to attack Donovan with insults. He simply denied his legitimacy. In one of the most famous scenes of Don't Look Back, Donovan is invited into Dylan's hotel room. He politely plays To Sing For You, a soft, pleasant ballad. Dylan listens without much expression, then responds by performing It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, a lyrical masterpiece laced with subtle venom. Many critics saw the moment as a symbolic destruction of the imitator. Dylan's performance dwarfed Donovan's, not in aggression, but in brilliance. He was making a point: you can't be me. To his credit, Donovan has never spoken badly of Dylan. In fact, he always showed admiration. In a 2005 interview he said, "Bob was a huge influence, yes, but we all were being influenced. I was never trying to copy him." But the damage was done. Dylan's dismissal followed Donovan for decades. Critics used it to undermine Donovan's originality, and the British Dylan label became more curse than compliment. Though never a loud war, Dylan's dismissal of Donovan remains one of the most analyzed moments in music rivalry history. Donovan continued to have success, Sunshine Superman, Mellow Yellow, but he never escaped Dylan's shadow. Dylan, for his part, never publicly softened his stance. He never praised Donovan's songwriting, never referenced him positively. Silence, once again, was Dylan's sword. 2. Neil Young. To the untrained ear, Bob Dylan and Neil Young might appear as musical cousins. Two gravel-throated prophets wandering across decades of cultural upheaval, guitars in hand. They're both seen as loners, rebels, icons of individualism. And on the surface, they've publicly shared admiration for each other. Young has even described Dylan as the greatest songwriter of all time. But dig deeper into Dylan's cryptic comments, his tone in interviews, and certain cutting dismissals, and another story emerges. One of thinly veiled disapproval, quiet annoyance, and maybe even resentment. Let's unravel the myth and dive into the real relationship between Bob Dylan and Neil Young. One of the most cited criticisms Bob Dylan has ever made, though often subtly, is about Neil Young's voice. Dylan has never directly insulted Young with profanity or rage, but he has made sardonic comments that left no room for confusion. In a 1985 interview with Spin magazine, when asked about other songwriters, Dylan said, "Some people have a voice like sand and glue. That works for them. Others just have sand." While Dylan never explicitly said Neil Young's name, many close to him and critics alike interpreted this as a jab. Young's high, nasal tone has long been polarizing. While fans find it raw and emotional, Dylan, who himself has faced criticism for his unique voice, seemed to draw a line between unique and unpleasant. Even in Chronicles, Volume 1, Dylan seemed to position himself apart from musicians like Young, emphasizing his own roots in blues, folk and early rock and roll, as opposed to the psychedelic or grunge-adjacent territories Young embraced. Despite their artistic differences, Dylan and Young have shared stages. They toured together in 1975, again in 1988 as part of the Bridge School benefit, and even performed at the Bob Dylan 30th anniversary concert celebration in 1992. Yet, backstage accounts suggest that Dylan often kept Young at arm's length. He didn't hang out with him much. One road manager from the 1988 tour recalled, "Dylan never really warmed up to Neil. He respected his catalog, sure. But he didn't like being around him. Said he was too dramatic. Too self-important." It's a recurring theme. Dylan doesn't dislike Neil Young's work, he seems irritated by his persona. In a 1991 press conference in Italy, a journalist asked Dylan what he thought of Rockin' in the Free World, Young's iconic anti-establishment anthem. Dylan's response? "It's alright. He's got his thing. Not my thing but a thing." That cold ambiguity is so Dylan. He rarely confronts. He simply shrinks, disarms with irony, or shrugs his way into critique. In Dylan's world, a lukewarm "not my thing" is far more brutal than an angry outburst. Neil Young has always been deeply expressive in public. He's written openly about politics, love, the environment, and even personal loss. He's emotive, confessional, and unafraid to wail on his guitar for 10 minutes straight. Dylan, on the other hand, hates being pinned down. He abhors the idea of being a voice of a generation, despite inadvertently becoming one. His lyrics are dense, poetic, layered with mystery. He gives nothing away for free. This philosophical divide created unspoken tension. Dylan once told Rolling Stone, "Some folks want to explain everything. They don't get it. You put too much light on something and it disappears." This could easily apply to Young's activism-laden approach. Dylan believed in implication. Young often leaned into declaration. Their art forms clashed, even if they admired each other from a safe distance. Perhaps the most controversial moment came in the 1990s when fans accused Neil Young of borrowing elements of Dylan's songwriting style and themes, especially in albums like Harvest Moon and Sleeps with Angels. Dylan never openly addressed these claims, but a close friend of his, musician Robbie Robertson, once mentioned, "Bob hears everything. When someone echoes him too closely, he notices. And he doesn't like it." Whether Young was intentionally borrowing or simply evolving alongside Dylan, the similarities drew comparisons Dylan likely didn't appreciate. After all, he hated being imitated. See Chapter 1 on Donovan. Publicly, Neil Young has always expressed admiration for Dylan. In his autobiography Waging Heavy Peace, Young writes, "Bob Dylan's words are like a storm, shaking your brain. He's the best there is." Dylan, when asked about Neil Young at a 2006 press junket, simply replied, "He's still doing what he does." It's hard to call that a compliment. It sounds more like polite indifference. In 2016, Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. It was a crowning moment in his career, and one that separated him permanently from all other songwriters. Neil Young publicly celebrated the win, but rumors circulated that Dylan was annoyed by Young's overpraise. One backstage rumor from the Desert Trip Music Festival suggested Dylan found the whole congratulatory atmosphere too fake. Whether or not that's true, what is clear is that Dylan didn't seek Young's approval, and didn't particularly value it. In the final years of their parallel careers, Dylan and Young have stopped crossing paths. Dylan doesn't mention him. Young still speaks kindly. But the silence is telling. One longtime Dylan roadie said in 2020, "Bob doesn't hate many people. But he doesn't forgive creative sins. If he thinks you took from him, misused it, or didn't get it, he closes the door." For Dylan, Neil Young might represent that category, a creative spirit that strayed too far into imitation, theatrics, or self-importance.
3. Tom Paxton.
In the early 1960s, Bob Dylan and Tom Paxton both walked the smoky, beer-scented halls of Greenwich Village. They were children of Woody Guthrie. They sang about injustice, war, and corporate greed. The folk scene of that era was more than a musical community, it was a spiritual movement. Dylan, Paxton, Joan Baez, and Phil Ochs were its firebrands. Tom Paxton, in particular, was a man of conviction. His songs like "What Did You Learn in School Today?" and the Ballad of Spiro Agnew mocked war, power, and corruption. He believed that folk music had a purpose, to be the conscience of a generation.
To him, it was sacred. But Dylan had other plans.
It was July 25, 1965. The Newport Folk Festival, the holiest site of the folk revival, was ready for another sermon from the voice of the movement, Bob Dylan. But what the audience got instead was electric guitar, distortion, and defiance. Dylan's performance of Maggie's Farm and Like a Rolling Stone, backed by members of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, was so loud and jarring that many in the audience booed. Some say it was because of the volume, others say it was betrayal. Backstage, Tom Paxton was furious. He reportedly turned to Pete Seeger and others and said, "What the hell is he doing? This is sacrilege." And from that moment forward, Dylan and Paxton became enemies, not in tabloids but in principle. Tom Paxton didn't hold back. In interviews over the following years, he made it clear, Dylan had abandoned the mission. In a 1966 Sing Out! Magazine interview, Paxton said, "He was the one we trusted. He was supposed to carry the torch. But now he's just a rock star in leather boots." He even coined a nickname for Dylan, the Judas of folk. Dylan, famously cryptic, didn't respond directly. But those close to him said he felt deeply wounded by Paxton's statements. In Chronicles, Volume 1, Dylan refers to some of his early village friends turning against him like dogs. And while he doesn't name Paxton, many believe he was one of them. The divide between Dylan and Paxton wasn't about sound, it was about what music is for. Tom Paxton believed music should protest, guide, and expose injustice. Bob Dylan believed music should evolve, explore, and reflect the individual spirit. Dylan had no interest in being a symbol. He once said, "I'm just a song and dance man." That infuriated Paxton.
To him, it was cowardice.
Dylan's refusal to join anti-war protests, his avoidance of political anthems after 1964, these were unforgivable sins in Paxton's eyes. While Dylan never publicly named Paxton, he reportedly told friends in the late 1960s, "Tom's a museum piece. He's stuck in amber." He also refused to ever perform at events Paxton headlined. When asked in 1975 about the old Greenwich Village scene, Dylan said, "Some of those guys are still playing coffee houses. They're still singing about the war. That war's been over." It was a thinly veiled reference to people like Paxton, artists who, in Dylan's mind, were stuck in the past, clinging to a movement that no longer spoke to the times. Unlike some other Dylan rivalries, this one never thawed. Paxton continued his activism and songwriting career, earning a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2009. But he remained skeptical of Dylan's motives for decades. In a 2005 BBC interview, when asked whether he'd ever reconcile with Dylan, Paxton said,
"Reconcile what? He made his choice.
And I made mine." That said everything. Their story is a tragedy of idealism. Two men who once shared a dream of changing the world through music, divided forever by what that dream should sound like. Dylan became the chameleon, the legend, the Nobel laureate. Paxton remained the activist, the purist, the folk warrior. Each carved out a legacy. But for Bob Dylan, Paxton was a relic of a world he had outgrown. For Tom Paxton, Dylan was a deserter. For Elvis Presley. To understand why Bob Dylan would later express disdain for Elvis Presley, we have to go back to the beginning, when Dylan was still Robert Zimmerman, a teenager growing up in Hibbing, Minnesota. He once said, "When I first heard Elvis, I knew I wasn't going to work for anybody ever again." That line, often quoted in reverence, tells us something important. Dylan didn't hate Elvis from the start. In fact, he idolized him. As a young man, Dylan played Elvis songs obsessively. He even tried to emulate Elvis's style and swagger in his early garage bands. Like millions of other teenagers in the 1950s, Dylan saw Elvis as a symbol of rebellion and freedom. But as Dylan grew and matured, both as a person and as an artist, he started to see cracks in the myth of Elvis Presley. And those cracks would later turn into resentment. By the early 1960s, Dylan had arrived in New York. He was reinventing himself, not as a pop star, but as a folk singer, a poet, and a cultural force.
And Elvis?
He was in Hollywood, making formulaic films with lifeless scripts and bubblegum soundtracks. The king of rock and roll had become an industry puppet, churning out content for money rather than meaning.
Dylan noticed.
He reportedly told Joan Baez in 1964, "Elvis could have changed everything.
But he sold out.
He could have been dangerous. Instead, he became safe." Dylan never forgave Elvis for this. He saw him as a man with unlimited influence, who gave it all up for fame, fortune, and a Cadillac lifestyle. Elvis starred in over 30 movies, most of which were widely criticized, even by fans. Dylan, the man who worshipped French New Wave and Italian cinema, reportedly mocked Elvis's movies behind closed doors. According to a close friend from the mid-60s, Dylan would do a fake Elvis voice and pretend to pitch bad movie ideas. "What if I'm a race car driver, but I also sing? And I fall in love with a girl who hates music?"
Genius.
Though said in jest, it reflected a deep disappointment. For Dylan, Elvis had become a parody of himself. In 1968, Elvis staged one of the most famous musical comebacks in history, NBC's Elvis Comeback Special. He was dressed in black leather, raw and powerful again, reclaiming the edge he had lost. Many fans were thrilled. Even Dylan watched it, and reportedly gave a tepid reaction. "He's pretending to be dangerous again." That quote, attributed by drummer Levon Helm in a backstage story, illustrates Dylan's cynicism. Even when Elvis tried to return to form, Dylan didn't buy it. It was, in his mind, still a performance, a facsimile of rebellion. Bob Dylan built his entire career on individualism and authorship. He wrote his own songs, often recording them in 1 or 2 takes, raw and unpolished. He resisted commercial pressure and defied his own fans. Elvis, on the other hand, rarely wrote his own music. Most of his hits were penned by other people. And under the control of Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, Elvis's image and career were tightly packaged for mass appeal. To Dylan, this was a betrayal of music itself. In an interview from the 1980s, Dylan said, "When the business gets in the way of the art dies." Elvis is the biggest example of that. As the 1970s wore on, Elvis became a caricature. Bloated, depressed, addicted to prescription drugs, and increasingly isolated, he spiraled into decline. Dylan observed it all with cold clarity. He told a journalist in 1982,
He was trapped.
"They turned him into a product and left him there." There was no joy in Dylan's tone, just disillusionment. Elvis's death in 1977 did not come as a shock to Dylan. He had seen it coming for years. Interestingly, after Elvis's death, Dylan paid a quiet tribute. During several concerts in the late 70s, he performed That's All Right, Mama and Mystery Train. But he never spoke about it publicly, never gave glowing eulogies, never got emotional. In fact, he once told a French interviewer, "You can love someone and still be angry at what they became." It was perhaps the most honest thing he ever said about Elvis. Elvis reportedly admired Dylan, though he didn't understand him. He asked about him once in 1965 and listened to Blonde on Blonde in his limo. But Elvis didn't have the vocabulary to analyze Dylan. To him, Dylan was that poet guy. Their worlds never truly collided. And maybe that's why Dylan felt so free to judge him, because he didn't see Elvis as a peer. He saw him as a fallen hero. If you've made it this far, you're clearly a serious music history fan. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss deep dives like this. Which of these rivalries surprised you the most? Did Dylan go too far, or was he simply holding others to the standard he held for himself? Let us know in the comments below.